Okay, so we're going to start on chapter 3 today, which is interest groups. Interest groups are important both on the federal and the state levels. It's how we get things done. It's how corporations get tax breaks, or we push for things like medical marijuana. So interest groups are both necessary and also kind of a pain, to be quite honest. They're basically I think of the right phrase, a necessary evil. Okay, so we're going to talk about the types of interest groups today, and a little bit about lobbying, which is always a fun conversation. Okay, so what exactly is an interest group? Essentially, it's an organization, and it's made up of individuals that have some kind of shared goal or cause. So people who want Texas to be better at recycling might form an interest group, or veterans working for better benefits, things like that. So it's a group of people who say, you know what, we have this in common, why don't we join together and try to lobby the government? Of course, it's easier to lobby if you're in a group than by yourself. One person sends a letter to their state senator, okay, whatever. 500 people send a letter, that's a different story. And we do have, of course, political interest groups. What their main goals are basically to get politicians to give them what they want. To give their group tax breaks, or a fair deal on the purchase of land, or less regulations on the oil rigs, for example. So they're trying to get politicians to create the policies that will help them out. They're also sometimes involved in trying to get politicians elected who are seen as sympathetic to their cause. Someone who's seen as sympathetic to the NRA or oil interests. And they are protected by the First Amendment. So it is free speech, it's protected. So if you join an interest group, it is protected by the First Amendment. They can't force you to shut up, basically, unless you break the law. And while there is a bit of overlap between a political party and an interest group, they have separate causes. A political party has a very broad focus. They want to get people elected to office. Democrats want to win the White House. Republicans want to hold on to the White House. So they're more interested in personnel. Who's serving in what office? An interest group, it's not that they don't care who's running, it's that most of the time their attitude is, no matter who wins, we're still going to lobby them. So they're more focused on their specific cause, their specific issue. So they don't always care who's in charge. They just care what that person's going to do in office. So parties are a bit more broad and focused. Interest groups are more narrow. So while there is some overlap, they are looking at different areas. They're not working for the same things. There's 6 main types of interest groups that we see in Texas, but also on the national level. And the first and the biggest is economic groups. manufacturing groups, labor unions. For example, the AFL-CIO, the Texas Bankers Association. So they want to know, basically, what can we do to help our members? How do we get benefits for unions or corporations? There's also a spiritual/religious interest group. Church organizations, pro-life groups tend to be spiritual or religious. They tend to focus on lobbying for things like abstinence-only education, restricting abortion, making it easier to build a new church somewhere. So their focus is pretty specific. There's also recreational groups, art groups, theater groups, sports, things like that. Your local dodgeball group, for example. And with art interest groups, they're going to lobby for more funding of the arts, or for contracts to build murals for cities, things like that. Then you have ethnic interest groups like the NAACP. And basically, they're just going to try to work to help out their various ethnic interest groups, trying to help out Hispanic Texans, African Americans, Muslims, and so on. Interesting fact, here in Texas, the most widely spoken foreign language after Spanish is Vietnamese. Yeah. There's a really cool map that shows the most common foreign language in the state besides Spanish, and Vietnamese is the most common in Texas after Spanish. Partly because of the settlement of the Vietnamese refugees from the 70s. But of course, they're going to be interested in trying to advocate for their causes. It's why you get a lot of forms that are English, Spanish, Vietnamese, French, and other languages. There's also local government, counties, groups like Make Weslaco Drain Again, which we're pushing for the passage of the $100 million bond to improve the drainage system here in Weslaco. They had a Facebook page, and they named it Make Weslaco Drain Again. And they're pushing for people to vote on the bond referendum. And then there's public interest. The League of Women Voters is a public interest group. They're advocating for an interest that's something that appeals to most people. The League of Women Voters gets involved with holding debates for candidates, registering people to vote, signing people up to be poll workers. They're nonpartisan, they're very well respected, and they tend to show up during elections and really get people out to the polls. They'll set up carpooling for people who don't have transportation, clear signage to the polls, things like that. It's obviously important to everyone who's eligible to vote. Well, an interesting little fact, Old Navy, the company, has started a deal where they will basically pay their workers for 8 hours if they go and work as poll workers on election day. They're going to pay their employees to volunteer at the polls. Yeah. Because we're going to need a lot of poll workers for this election. So, and if you're a registered voter, you can volunteer. Yep. And they'll do a little basic training with you. Mostly it's just checking someone's ID against the voter registration laws, showing them how to use the machine, and moving on. It's relatively easy.
We should have it here prior to COVID. I don't know if they're going to do it here.
The early voting? They might. If there's enough demand, because people may not want to go election day, so they may they may want to create a polling station here on campus. We had 20 weeks in the early voting this year, which is really smart. So you can be like, hey guys, go vote. Leave my class and go vote and come back. Yeah. So yeah, if you're registered to vote, you can do work on election day, and they will be very happy to have you. Okay. So interest groups have various roles, various purposes. One is to provide information to the government. How are the people feeling about a particular issue? How are they feeling about the response to COVID, or gun control, or environmental damage? So they're kind of the bridge between the people and the government. They're a way of letting the government know, hey, this is what the people want. We've talked to them, here's what they want from you. It's a way to let the members know what's happening. If there's going to be a city hall meeting on a contentious topic like gun-free zones, then they'll let the members know, hey, this is coming up, you may want to attend the meeting. Or discussions about waste management, water quality, things like that. They'll let them know, hey, you know, Beto O'Rourke is coming to speak in the Senate campaign, let's all go hear him speak, things like that. They can also help contribute to elections, get people out to the polls, inform the voters about a candidate who's running, especially at the local level. Nationally, it's not hard to find the information. Locally, it's a bit trickier. So they can let the people know, here's this candidate who's running for mayor, here's some information about him or her that you might need to make your decision on election day. Or we're going to set up a van and we're going to take people from this retirement home and we're going to get them all to the polls, things like that. They can also form public opinion. It's important to know how people are feeling on a particular issue. Obviously, the governor is going to want to know, how are the people feeling about his response to COVID? Are they happy, unhappy? Are they wanting change? So interest groups can be a way of gauging the level of support for an issue or political candidate, things like that. And they're a way to get people involved in government. If all you have to do is sign a petition or go to a meeting or show up on election day, why not, right? It makes it a lot easier to get involved in the political process. Makes it a lot less complicated. So it's a good way to get people involved in talking to their government officials, saying, State Senator Lucio, we don't like this, you need to kind of think about it a little bit more. And if you join a group for personal reasons, you're going to want to be more heavily involved. If you have a really strong feeling about the cause, you're more likely to show up. If you're someone who vehemently opposes the death penalty, you may go up to Huntsville and go up to the executions and protest outside of them, or lobby for the death penalty to not be applied in certain cases. If you feel like you have a personal outcome in the stake of a decision, you're more likely to participate. If it doesn't really matter to you, you can be like, whatever. But if you have a personal connection, if you're vehemently pro-life, you're more likely to get involved and stay involved. Because when you win, that feeling is incredible, right? You're like, yeah, we won, this is great. So the more personally attached you are, the more likely you are to stay involved in this particular interest group. Were any of you involved in an interest group of some kind? No? Cool. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Yeah. That's cool. Yeah. And that was the only license to perform abortions in the valley. Yeah. That's if I found the others.
Well, it's on.
Yeah. Yeah, I almost got arrested once, but it was, yeah, you're like, of course you almost got arrested, right? Yeah. I was testing against the genocide in Darfur on my college campus, and I had a couple of students acting like dead bodies, and I was like handing out literature so people like pay attention to it. And a cop came by and he's like, "Do you have a permit?" I'm like, "I'm on the free speech side of the zone. I don't think I need one." He was talking to me for a minute. He's like, "All right, just move it back from the sidewalk a couple of feet." But for a minute, I actually thought I was going to get arrested. Like, if you're going to get arrested for something, it might as well be something you believe in.
Yeah.
Okay. The better organized an interest group, the more likely they are to succeed. Economic interest groups are better organized. They can hire people to lobby for them. They can spend money on public campaigns, feel-good things. So oil and gas producers are more politically organized. We consumers are not, right? We might protest the sudden spike in gas prices, but politically there's not much we can do about it. So businesses are better organized, so they're more likely to get what they want. Again, they can hire PR people, right? After the oil spill off the Gulf of Mexico, you better bet that BP was hiring a bunch of people to rehabilitate their image. All these ads about how we're cleaning things up, we're giving money to the people affected by the spill, we're doing this and that, because people were boycotting the stations, and of course they're not going to want to lose the money. So economic groups are better organized than consumer groups. And this usually translates into businesses winning and consumers not as much. That's not always the case. We do have an impact, of course, on companies. If we decide to boycott BP for 4 months, they're going to start making the changes the consumers want. But by and large, with the state government, they are going to get what they want more often than not. They have the money, they have the personnel, and they know how to lobby. As citizens, it can be hard to figure out how we should lobby, whom we should lobby, and how we get what we want. And the more education and income, the higher the level of participation. If you have a master's, a PhD, an MD, a D, you have more knowledge of how to lobby, how to get the government to do what you want. And also, if you're making $100,000 a year, you've got a little bit of free time and money to participate. If you're working a 9 to 5, you've got some more time to participate in a group than someone who's working 2 jobs and doesn't get home until midnight. The reality is, the better your education level, the more money you make, the more organized you are, and the better the chances are that you're going to get what you want. Again, it does matter if you have a personal stake or if it's economic. If it's economic, you might care, you might not, right? You might be like, this would have been nice, but okay, whatever. But if you feel really strongly that the minimum wage needs to be raised, or Weslaco needs better recycling, then you're going to keep pushing, you're going to keep advocating. You're not going to just give up easily. You're going to keep going with that organization. So it does tend to make a difference. And of course, the two can be intertwined, right? The minimum wage hasn't gone up in over a decade. So for some people, the economic is personal. If you're a minimum wage worker, of course, it's important to you that the minimum wage gets raised. So they can be connected. Okay, now we get into the fun part of how interest groups work in elections, aka how money can essentially buy an election. Yeah, that's a little harsh, but it's true. Okay. Interest groups will form what's called a political action committee. Basically, what it is it's a way to collect and distribute money to a candidate or a political party. There are some regulations on PACs, but when Citizens United was decided in 2010, essentially the court said corporations are people in terms of free speech and opened the door for unlimited amount of money to be used in elections. That's why the 2012 election, Mitt Romney and Barack Obama spent $4 billion on the election. Yeah. Yeah, you want to run for president, you pretty much have to be a millionaire at this point. We're very good at fundraising. Yeah, very good at getting people to part with their money. There's also different types of interest groups. A 527, basically the rule is if you don't formally endorse a party or a candidate, you can spend as much money as you want on a campaign ad. So these are the ads you see that say not affiliated with Donald Trump for president or not affiliated with Joe Biden for president. Candidates, if it's their ad, they have to release a statement at the beginning or the end of the ad that says, I'm Joe Biden and I approve this message. So if you want to use a really negative ad, but you don't want to endorse it, you can ask the 527 to run it, basically, and just say not affiliated with the campaign. More often than not, they know what these 527s are doing. There's also a 510c4. Basically, this is an interest group that is designed to be civic or some kind of social welfare thing. Basically, it's a non-profit interest group. So if someone sets up a group and says, the purpose of this 510c4 is to get people out to vote, then they do not, by law, have to disclose who's contributing and how much. Now, they cannot endorse a candidate, but because they are considered a non-profit group, it's considered dark money. You don't know who's donating and you don't know how much they're giving. So a lot of the money goes into elections. We don't necessarily know where it's coming from. And a lot of that, again, is because of Citizens United. 2010, basically the Supreme Court said corporations are people in terms of free speech, and you can't restrict the right of interest groups to donate to candidates. So they removed the restrictions on the amount of money that could be given by an interest group. So basically, they removed the barrier to unlimited funding in elections. And of course, there's always interest with issues with potential bribery. There's a guy, Harold Simmons, who gave $37 million to politicians in one election cycle because he wanted to get a nuclear waste depository permit. He got the permit. They found out he basically bribed the officials, and he only got fined about $6,450. They got fined $6,000, and he spent $37 million and got what he wanted in the end. For a billionaire, that's nothing. I mean, he could probably spend $6,000 on lunch in one day, right? It's not a big fine for him. So for him, of course, it's worth it to bribe someone. In the end, you're not going to get hit that hard by it. Okay, so I do want to show you an example of a 527 ad that was run by a group in the 2018 Senate election. This ad was not run on television for a reason you'll see here, but this is an example of an ad run by an interest group and not by an actual candidate. Uh-oh. I have to turn it up down here too. Let me see. Oh, shoot. Hang on. I have to... Ah, crap, volume's not working. Okay. Of course. That's probably not going to work. Nope. Maybe work. I think this is something silly. All right. Let's see if this works.
Hey, come on. If somebody called my wife a dog and said my daddy was in on the Kennedy assassination, I wouldn't be kissing their ass. You stick a finger in their chest and give them a few choice words. Or you drag their ass out by the woodshed and kick their ass, Ted. Come on, Ted.
Political ad paid for by FTC PAC, not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee.
Okay, that is a 527 ad. Obviously, like I said, not run on television because, yeah, but it was online and it got a lot of publicity online because it was, you know, basically a YouTube ad calling Ted Cruz a coward, basically, which I'm sure Beto actually basically tried to never go negative in his campaign, so I'm sure someone allowed something like that to run, and you know, so it wouldn't be affiliated with him. So that's a 527 ad. You can attack a candidate as long as you basically say not affiliated with any particular campaign. Okay. Interest groups also very much get involved in lobbying. This is where someone will go up to a state senator and say, I'm so-and-so with BP, I'd like to schedule a meeting with you. So they try to work one-on-one with a politician. They will go up to Austin when the legislature is in session and set up meetings for lunch or coffee or a private meeting in a state senator's office. Because of course, it's a lot easier if you're talking to someone face to face, right? It's harder for them to just ignore you. There's about 1,900 registered lobbyists in Texas. There is a list. You can see who's registered as a lobbyist and what company. Most of them are the big companies: Amazon, Google, Walmart, BP, Shell, etc. If they are very good at their job, they can earn a little over $1 million in a legislative session. If you work for a major corporation and you're good at your job, you're going to be making a pretty nice chunk of money. Therefore, most of the lobbyists work for the wealthy interest groups, economic groups, major farm companies, oil producers, railroads, things like that. If you're curious about who's lobbying for what, you can put in like Texas lobbying registry, and you can actually see the address, the name, and the company they're lobbying for. So there is some transparency in that sense, some accountability as to who's lobbying and for what. Second is direct personal contact with the legislators, buying them lunch, talking to them, walking into the chamber, shaking their hand and introducing yourself. Especially if you're a relatively new lobbyist. If you just got hired by Walmart, you're probably going to want to introduce yourself to the legislators and say, hey, let's, talk over lunch or something like that. If you're representing a poorer interest group, a citizens group, a group like the ACLU, well, not the ACLU, the Humane Society, or advocating for poor Texans, obviously, you're not going to be able to buy them expensive lunches. So what you have to do is be incredibly persistent. You have to call them constantly. You have to be standing outside their office door. You have to basically make yourself a major pain in the neck to get them to pay attention to you. So largely, the poorer interest groups have to rely on people for personal connection, because you have to be persistent and you really have to believe in the cause. You have to have some very strong feelings to show up every day and essentially harass them until you get an appointment. The problem with lobbying, in some ways, is it's a very, very, very thin line between bribery and a legitimate campaign contribution. Things like gift giving, buying an expensive dinner, taking them out to see a play, giving them speaking fees for speaking to your group, that's legal. So again, the line is pretty thin, right? If you take someone out to a $100 steak dinner, is that a bribe or is that a legitimate contribution? It gets pretty blurred. Unless are important because legislators can't know everything about every bill all of the time. They don't have enough time with the short, irregular sessions to know everything that's in a bill. So the lobbyist can tell them, hey, here's what the bill actually says. Here's the important points you need to know out of this. So they'll listen to the lobbyists. They'll listen to them and let them buy them lunch or take them out to see a play or buy their kid a birthday present so they can know what's going on. So they do provide a lot of very valuable information. So on the one hand, they can be a force for good. On the other hand, sometimes they get a little too close, a little too corruptible. It's a very fine line. And they do tend to develop personal relationships with the legislators. Get to know them, get to know their families. So it can be really tough to tell the lines. Now, there have been attempts to regulate lobbying through an ethics commission. If a lobbyist is clearly breaking the rules, then they can be given a fine. If it's really blatantly clear that they've broken the law, then the Travis County District Attorney can possibly charge them with a criminal offense. If we have to get 3/4 of the commission to take action, which is rare, so most of the time it's usually just a fine, if anything. It's very rare for a lobbyist to end up going to jail, unless it's super blatant. Candidates also have to disclose how much money they have in their campaign account, file a report yearly saying this is how much money I have on hand, and if they're a lawyer and someone pays them to delay a trial for a product, for example, during the legislative session, they have to disclose that. They have to say, this pharmaceutical company paid me to delay a trial about one of their drugs, so until after the legislative session. So there's some attempts to regulate who's doing what, though of course it's not exactly clear sometimes what's a bribe, what's not, what's legitimate, what's basically trying to pay someone. Interest groups, of course, do try to lobby the public as well. If it's something like you want the voters to pass a constitutional amendment, you might create a series of ads that run throughout Texas saying, vote yes on Amendment 3 or vote no on Amendment 4. And it's a way of trying to get people interested in what the group is doing, knowing what is happening, things like that. And sometimes it can get pretty ugly. SBC and Verizon wanted the state legislature to allow them to come into the Texas telecommunications industry, provide cable and internet. And the smaller companies didn't want Verizon coming in because they said, well, you'll lower the price, you'll reduce the competition, we won't be able to compete against you, we'll go out of business, so we don't want you here in Texas. Both sides accused each other of being selfish and dishonest. The video ads turned pretty ugly, accusations of corruption, lying to the voters, things like, oh, Verizon's gonna hike the prices as soon as you sign the contract, things like that. And because it got ugly, people started paying attention. Before this, most people were like, whatever, if they even paid attention. But when it got ugly, people started paying attention and going, what's going on here? Why are these two sides running these ads that are so negative and so nasty? And so they started paying attention, and they started lobbying the state legislature for or against this. So ads can be useful to the interest groups because people may pay attention at that point. They may get involved in a cause that they didn't care about before. And in the end, Verizon won. Verizon was allowed to enter into the market, thus paving the way for the big companies that we see in Texas, AT&T, Spectrum, and so on. It's why, by and large, we don't really have small independent cable companies anymore. You're basically stuck with AT&T and Spectrum here in the Valley, right? We don't have a lot of choice, partly because of these mergers. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. Like Metro was bought out by T-Mobile, and T-Mobile bought out Sprint or vice versa, which I was like, no, because I don't like Sprint. Yeah, they're all basically merging together. And in some places, you don't even get a choice. Like, when I was living in Boston, I think our only choice for internet was Comcast. There was literally no one else. So if you don't like the service, too bad, yeah, you don't get a choice. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And in some ways that's smart, right? Because if you can put it all under one bill, why wouldn't you? You know, it might be easier to just have all of your service through AT&T if your phone service is with AT&T. So for some people it's smart. For others, we're like, can you guys just stop merging together? Because I liked my phone service before you guys got bought out by Sprint, you know? Yeah, I'm just going to go on a personal rant here. I freaking hate Sprint. Their cell phone service is terrible. Their customer service is horrible. Yeah. I had a Sprint phone when I was living in Boston, in the city, and I was on the phone with my friend one night, and he dropped the call 8 times. I'm living in the freaking heart of Boston, and the cell service didn't work. I know. And he's like, no. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I have a family plan with my parents and older sister, and we pay $100 a month total for the prepaid phones. And so you can't get a better deal than that. You just can't. Is the service great? No, but I mean, who wants to pay $100 each for a phone, right? So in the end, we just kind of got screwed. Get screwed. Okay. We also see interest groups getting involved with state agencies. Of course, we do need administrative agencies to protect our interests. We need OSHA. We need workplace safety for the oil rigs. It's a dangerous enough job to begin with. We don't need to make it worse than it already is. We need protections from products that could be potentially lethal. To give kind of a relevant example, there's been a COVID-19 vaccine trial in the UK, and they had to just suspend it because someone had an adverse reaction to the vaccine. This is actually standard. If someone has an adverse reaction, they have to pause it. But that's good, because then they can figure out what happened and fix it, right? We don't want them just being like, oh, well, people could die from the vaccine, let's put it out there, right? We don't want that happening. Yeah, don't inject Clorox, exactly. Don't inject Clorox into your veins, yeah. So we need these agencies to protect us. The problem is, a lot of the time what happens is the people who serve on the agencies come from the industries that are being regulated. This can be good because they'll know what the industry needs, and sometimes they can be immune to the lobbying, right? They can have a better knowledge of the tactics the agency will use. The downside is that sometimes that means they tend to sympathize with the industries instead. That they're like, yeah, I remember what it was like to be dealing with, oil rig regulations. Maybe we should roll this particular protection back. And so at one point there were 4 people employed as executive director for the Texas Natural Resource Conservation Commission that had worked for utility, landfill, and oil companies. So basically they came from the industries they were trying to regulate. And again, this isn't that uncommon. Interest groups will hire former regulators to lobby for them, and then vice versa. So it's kind of like a circle. You serve as a regulator for the oil industry, you leave the job, you lose an election, something like that. The oil industry hires you to lobby for them because you know how the agency works. And the problem, in a lot of ways, is once a regulation gets passed, we stop paying attention. If a company has to recall its food because of salmonella poisoning, once they fix the problem, we just stop caring. We don't really pay that much attention and say, have you fixed the problem in a way where this won't happen again? Oh, you fixed it temporarily, fine. Or, okay, yeah, you've passed more regulations on the oil industry to protect the workers. Okay, we're done, right? So we pay attention when it's on the table, but that's it. And so it ends up helping the industries because if we're not paying attention, then they can sneak in some kind of change and we're not going to be paying attention until the next recall or disaster or something that gets our attention again. And that's human nature, right? You pay attention to a headline news story and 2 days later, you're gone, you're done, you moved on. Now, where a consumer interest group can be a little bit more useful or a little bit more effective is in the courts. Because judges are elected in Texas, interest groups do contribute to judicial campaigns. An interest group for law enforcement is going to donate to a judge who says, I'm a law and order candidate, I'm going to crack down on criminals, And interest groups like the ACLU might contribute to a judge who says, you know what, we really need to reestablish the rule of law, we need to be more careful about these kinds of things. Because eventually, if they try a case before a judge that they help get elected, that may end up working in their favor. And they can hire lawyers, try to influence the legislatures in a pending case. They can basically have their lawyer talk to a member of the legislature who is a lawyer as well and say, lawyer to lawyer, can we talk about this particular case? And if it's an economic interest group and they have enough money, they can basically tie the government up in the courts for decades. The lawsuits against big tobacco are still ongoing. They've been fighting this fight for 20-something years. And they've had some victories, like you can't advertise cigarettes in television anymore, and some money being given to survivors, people who have had cancer, things like that, requiring the tobacco companies to start running anti-smoking ads, which is hilarious when you think about it. But they're still in court, right? It can take forever to get to a decision about a mining company that polluted the local water. It can take upwards of 20 years to get any kind of settlement money. On the other hand, citizen groups, ethnic groups, can use the courts to help their cause. The NAACP is quite frankly one of the most successful ethnic groups in using the courts. Lawyers like Thurgood Marshall and others who fought against Jim Crow cases, who fought against false rape allegations against African American men. And it was the NAACP who combined the four cases into Brown versus the Board of Education, and successfully argued that segregation in schools should be illegal. In the Nixon case, basically, they were able to get the Supreme Court to say in 1927 that African Americans should be allowed to vote in the Democratic primaries. We're talking almost 50 years before most other states allowed African Americans to participate in the primaries. So the NAACP is incredibly successful in a lot of ways in getting cases about racial discrimination heard by the courts. They've pushed for desegregation, issues with the drawing up of school districts, lack of pay in minority school districts, things like that. The ACLU is also successful in suing for civil liberties violations. When a student was suspended from school for refusing to recite the Pledge of Allegiance, they sued because you can't force a student to recite the Pledge of Allegiance. They've been involved in lawsuits where prisoners weren't allowed to grow out a beard despite that being one of the, not really requirements, but recommendations within Islam. Suing a school district that wouldn't allow a lesbian student to bring her girlfriend to prom with her. Things like that. So consumer groups, rights groups, more often than not, they're going to use the courts because they have the lawyers, they have the expertise, and they can get the courts to bypass a legislature that's reluctant to make any changes and force them to make changes. So the use of courts by consumer groups is really how they get something done. How they force a company to behave or force states to stop discriminating. So it can be really useful for the smaller interest groups. And it's also a way for us to go after companies that misbehave. There was a product on the market for a while called Escher, and it was supposed to be a form of tubal ligation for women that was minimally invasive. Basically, what they would do is insert copper wires into and wrap it around the fallopian tubes. It's supposed to be like a 20-minute outpatient procedure where they basically anesthetize you and go in.
Copper wire.
You can see the problem here, right? So what happens, what could possibly go wrong with this, right? So what happens is sometimes the wires had the tendency to slip and poke a uterus, and then women would have to have an emergency hysterectomy. So the women who had these problems sued the company in a class action lawsuit. The FDA pulled its license, basically, and the product was pulled from the market. Yeah. I mean, on the one hand, a tubal ligation traditionally is very invasive, so if you can find a way to make it minimally invasive, great. But this just wasn't it. So.
Not with wires.
Not with wires, yeah. Basically a set of wires that would wrap around the fallopian tubes and yeah. Okay, any other questions, comments for today? No? All right, go ahead and stop the recording.